beginning to rain.
Hello, my name's Dennis Reschke. You've tuned into the program Fresh Bread, a program dedicated to discussing the things of the kingdom of heaven. This is sixth part in a multi-part series on God and government. We left off last time talking about pacifism, and in line with that, some would argue that international disputes should be judged and mediated in the international court system, enforced by NATO and other such armies. There are several objections to this idea. One, it is wishful thinking. Such an effective worldwide government has never occurred in the entire history of the human race. This idea harkens back to the divine sanction of private property versus collective ownership by the state. I'm not a citizen of any other country but the U.S. I have no desire to die for another country so much as I do for my own. The socialist communistic idea of collective militates against human nature and God's idea of private property, the rights of the individuals, and the recognition of sovereign nations. Two, if such a powerful world government ever did exist, it would likely be dominated by the votes of numerous small nations who are largely anti-American, being either communistic or Muslim. Three, this would open the door to reducing the U.S. to a condition of servitude and domination by nation or leaders that seek its demise. Four, it's simply untrue to say violence always begets further violence. The use of violence by police to subdue a murderer's violent works quite well. The use of military force stopped numerous despots of the past, including Adolf Hitler. It stopped the Confederate armies from establishing a separate nation in which slavery would be preserved and protected. Of course, the misuse of violence by government or any other entity cannot be condoned. We must not throw the baby out with the bathwater here. Because governments have misused their power to wage war does not justify doing away with all government or eliminating standing armies. It rather causes us to be eternally vigilant to keep our respective governments on track by voting the righteousness of God. So what should a nation's defense policy be? Whatever the policies, it should have enough military power to be able to defeat any other nation or combination of nations that has the potential to attack. Some would argue that maintaining weaponry and a standing army increases the tension and instability in the world and therefore makes war more likely. But this claim comes from an underlying assumption that the ultimate cause of evil is not in the hearts of human beings, but in some influence outside the human heart. To the contrary, Scripture tells us that the human heart has both evil and good elements, and that some people who tend toward evil can become so powerful that it cannot be reached by reason or negotiation or compromise. It can only be restrained by the superior force of a just government. Military weapons for governments are God-ordained and are not themselves the cause of evil. However, no nation has the right to ever use military power simply to conquer other nations or impose their ideas of social good on another nation. Communism and Islam both have mandates to convert the whole world to their way of thinking, to their respective forms of government. Interestingly, Christianity also has a mandate to convert the world, but by dissimilar means. The former use force, imprisonment, or death to convert. Christianity uses the gospel and specifically states that physical means is not the way to make changes. That's 2 Corinthians 10, 3-5. Christianity also allows for freedom of choice, even after being presented someone with the gospel. The unbeliever, regrettably, is free to go to hell if they wish. Communism and Islam, on the other hand, seem to be intolerant of any who espouse opposing views. Today, the most eminent threats against the U.S. are from the Muslim countries that use terrorism as a tool to instill fear in the hearts of their enemies. The U.S. and its army deter these and other aggressors from carrying out their plans of world domination. Smaller countries with smaller armies are at a decided disadvantage. Alliances with larger countries, therefore, seem to be a viable option for them. I see no biblical reason to oppose this. God honored the people of Gibeon's alliance with Israel, even though it was made under deceptive information. That's Joshua chapter 9. Are such defense agreements appropriate? As long as nations voluntarily enter into such agreements and believe that both countries benefit from them, yes. Such alliances tend toward world peace and stability, something necessary for the gospel to be preached without hindrance. They also offer deterrent against other countries that desire to declare war against these smaller countries. Our nation is based on the supposition that all men are created equal and have certain God-given rights. This idea applies not only to U.S. citizens, but to all human beings outside the U.S. This gives us motive to help other countries and citizens who are not afforded these privileges. Unlike communism or other isms based on human thought, our mandate comes from the God of the Bible. Others may invoke their God, quote, to justify their agenda. To confuse the matter, the U.S. government often muddies the water by overstepping or abusing their authority and power in the lives of citizens in other countries with evil, thus casting a shadow on our God-given mandate. I should be quick to add that the U.S. has no special privilege with God. Any people of the world can embrace the gospel to their benefit and prosper as the U.S. has. South Korea is an example. I believe as the U.S. continues to turn her back on Christianity, our power and authority in the world will diminish incrementally. There are some who oppose intervening in the affairs of other countries. They say the U.S. is not the world police. They oppose, for example, supporting Israel because it immediately makes us an enemy of any Muslim country and subject to terrorist attacks. I believe this policy does violence to the parable of the Good Samaritan. Proverbs 3:27 says, "Do not withhold good from those to whom it is due when it is in your power to do it." Romans 13:8 says, "We owe love to everyone." The love of God gives for no reason other than for mercy. One of the reasons I believe the U.S. has prospered as much as it has because we are a giving nation. When we give, God sees to it that we receive back in return. In the book of Obadiah, the prophet rebuked the nation of Edom for its non-interventionist policy with regard to Israel. That's verse 11. When Babylon attacked Jerusalem, Edom stood aloof, quote, and failed to give military support to help their neighbor. With great power comes great responsibility. It seems to me the U.S. has an obligation to help out weaker nations when it can. If we have made treaties with them, there is no option but to help. The U.S. alliance with Taiwan has been the major reason that China has not attacked it. Our alliance with South Korea is the primary deterrent against North Korean invasion. Our support of Israel is a significant factor in preventing Arab nations from destroying that country. I believe it can be argued that U.S. help to other nations in the last 2 centuries has made the world more peaceful and more secure than it would have been otherwise. Superior military weaponry in the hands of a nation that protects freedom is a good thing for the world, not a harmful thing. Moving on to Islamic jihadism and international terrorism, the term jihad refers to a number of loosely related Islamic terrorist groups such as Al-Qaeda, Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Muslim Brotherhood, and various other smaller movements with similar convictions and goals. These groups constitute the greatest threat to American peace and security in the world today. They believe that the use of any violent means is justified in order to advance the goal of forcible Muslim domination of other nations and eventually the entire world. The great majority of Muslims around the world do not subscribe to these views or techniques of violence. Unfortunately, Muslim extremists rule the governments of most Arab states and wield all the guns and military power. They are behind the terrorist attacks. Democracy, in their view, is against Islam because it places in the hands of people authority that properly belongs to God. Christianity, as a point of contrast, puts power supremely in the hands of God, but also, to a significant extent, to Christian believers. That's 1 Corinthians 3:9. The U.S., to their thinking, is the great evil because it blocks the restoration of the ancient Islamic caliphate or government. These people are generally not impoverished working class trying to rid the world of capitalism, but are usually educated and well-to-do. They are deeply motivated by their religious beliefs. They also hate us because we support Israel and the Jews, people they see as pigs. One might argue that this is simply the fight of one religion against another, Islam against Christianity or Judaism. If all religions are worshiping the same God, then their respective descriptions of this God would be virtually the same. This is not the case. The God of Islam is capricious, and salvation through him tenable. The only sure way of salvation, according to the Quran, is to kill an infidel, that is, a non-Muslim person. Christianity is also based on death, but not of a person. Jesus died once for all mankind. Salvation is based on faith in his propitiatory act of death on the cross and his resurrection from the dead. The God of the Bible is painted in a much different light. The two gods are not the same. The Eastern religions describe God in even more diverse a manner. Pantheism can never be reconciled with theism. What are the solutions to Islamic jihadism? There are several. The first is superior force. As mentioned earlier, the zeal and religious fervor of jihadists cannot be dissuaded with reason, bargaining, concessions, or negotiations. They will not stop until all nations come under Islamic rule of law. The only method that has proven successful is superior military and police force. In the past, both Egypt and Saudi Arabia have tried to appease extremist elements in their respective countries with various concessions at various times without success. Romans 13:4 speaks of government authority wielding terror to those who do evil. It is right, therefore, for a government who would oppose Islamic terrorism to use all their military and police might to capture and imprison, or, if necessary, kill hardened supporters of all Al-Qaeda and those who, with similar commitments. What about wiretapping? The argument against this technique of monitoring terrorist activity is that it is an infringement of private rights of law-abiding citizens. There is, of course, truth to this claim. However, much of the surveillance is electronic. That is, no one is actually listening in on conversations. Only the locations of individual callers is monitored and to whom they are calling. The modicum of personal freedom taken away by wiretapping is nothing compared to the overall benefit this technique affords us. The military and government agencies involved in these taps are all agree that the technique is effective and has stopped numerous attacks from being carried out. The liberal media and ACLU, that is the American Civil Liberty Union, opposes wiretapping because of privacy right issues. But what will the American public say when they are attacked again by terrorists? They will complain that the government is not doing enough to protect them. I believe these programs should continue because of their track record of success and because of the relatively small decrease in personal freedom that results. Another thing governments can do against terrorism is to sanction nations that harbor terrorists. In the U.S., in 2001, then President Bush declared his intention to treat countries that harbor terrorists as, quote, hostile regimes. After this declaration, Arab countries began cooperating in the war on terror by turning over thousands of terrorists and leads to the U.S. intelligence agencies. This technique worked. Another strategy can be taken by governments against terrorism is to persuade people in Muslim nations to turn against terrorist groups in their own country. They can inform authorities where groups are meeting and where bombs are being planted or made. There is a risk, of course, for these people to do that. Two incentives that helped them was the use of the U.S. military security and safety in their country and acts of charity and infrastructure improvements in their country that built confidence in the locals that we had their best interests in mind. Although Muslims claim their religion is one of peace, it must be understood that their notion of peace means everyone must convert to Islam for there to be peace. There's no freedom of religion or speech in Muslim countries. Anyone holding to other religions or other ideas contrary to radical Islam is persecuted, jailed, or killed. This is not the peace the Bible talks about. To be fair, Muslims are correct in their demonization of the United States, I believe. We have become an immoral nation, promulgating our pornography and liberalism into their world, breaking down their fabric of their societies. America has become a purveyor of alcoholism, drug addiction, gambling, pornography, the breakup of marriages, same-sex marriage, sexual immorality, disrespectful children, the breakdown of parental authority, widespread shoplifting and employee theft, dishonesty in all areas of life, and more. At this point, Christians should realize that historically it has been the proclamation by Christian pastors of the moral law of God and of universal accountability before God that has brought positive moral transformation in many societies. A government that supports biblical right and wrong standards is one that will help society get back on its feet. We need a spiritual revival. Regarding the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, I believe these were just wars, as discussed earlier. They were undertaken for a just cause, namely because of terrorist attacks on the U.S. in September of 2001, and because these countries trained and harbored terrorists. Our primary justification and motivation for launching these wars was to defend the United States against another similar attack. Saddam Hussein was paying $25,000 to the family of every terrorist who committed a suicide attack in Israel. Another just cause was that Saddam had never complied with the terms of surrender in the first Gulf War in 1993 because he was continuing to prevent site visits to verify that he had no nuclear weapons. Although no weapons of mass destruction were found, intelligence services were convinced that he had chemical and biological weapons. He had used them previously against Kurds in northern Iraq. There was substantial evidence that he was attempting to acquire nuclear weapons as well. Israel had destroyed Saddam's Osirak nuclear reactor as far back as June 7th of 1981 in a surprise air attack because Israel was convinced that Saddam was soon going to be able to develop nuclear weapons from it. Some apparently reliable sources have reported that Saddam transported large quantities of weapons of mass destruction to Syria just prior to the American invasion. But an even broader justification for the war was the conviction of President Bush and others in the leadership of both parties that if a genuinely functioning, free, and democratic government could begin to succeed in Iraq, it would provide a more effective long-term antidote to Islamic terrorism because countries that are governed by open democratic processes do not launch wars of conquest against other nations. Iraq now is a functioning democracy, as is Afghanistan. Although there is still much internal fighting, free elections have been held in both countries. Some would say the predominantly Muslim countries will never be able to function as democracies. But Turkey is 99.8% Muslim and has a democratically elected government. Pakistan is 95% Muslim and has a democratically elected government. And Indonesia is 86% Muslim with a democratically elected government. I believe in this form of government lies the greatest hope for reform against terrorism. Functioning democracies in Muslim nations will eventually give Islamic terrorists no place to train and no place to hide. Therefore, the war in Iraq was a necessary strategic and highly significant step in defending the United States against radical Islamic terrorism. It was undertaken for a just cause. It was declared by a competent authority, that is the U.S. government and the U.S. President and Congress. There was comparative justice because of the great evil propagated by the Taliban in Afghanistan and Saddam Hussein in Iraq. We had the right intention to free both countries from oppressive dictatorships and simultaneously to remove the threat of terrorism. It was our last resort after years of negotiation. We had great probability of success. The proportionality of projected results was excellent. Both countries now have functioning democracies with greater freedoms than they've had in times past. And lastly, the wars were carried out with the right spirit. War is evil, but necessary to prevent even greater loss of life should terrorism be allowed to continue. Moving on to the topic of nuclear weapons, 90,000 to 150,000 people were killed in Hiroshima out of 340,000 inhabitants, and about 80,000 were killed in Nagasaki, Japan, out of 212,000 inhabitants. About half of these people were killed immediately, and about half died later from radiation burns. Had America not dropped these atomic bombs, it is estimated that 500,000 more American lives would have been lost, and possibly hundreds of thousands of Japanese lives lost. This argues for the use of nuclear weapons. What prevented the Soviets from launching nuclear attacks against the U.S. and its Western allies during the Cold War? It was primarily the fear of overwhelming retaliation by the United States, the United Kingdom, and France. It was the possession of overwhelming numbers of nuclear weapons owned by peace-loving nations that prevented their use by any aggressor nation. That system of deterrence has worked perfectly now for more than 6 decades, since 1945. Today, the U.S. has a total of 5,113 operational nuclear weapons, while Russia has 5,200. The U.S. has dismantled 13,000 nuclear weapons since 1988. The reason for retaining such large numbers of weapons is because many of these weapons could be destroyed before they could be launched, others would fail, and others would not reach their targets. The weapons depend on a three-part delivery system: bombers, missiles, and submarines. Currently, the United Kingdom, France, China, India, the U.S., Russia, Pakistan, and North Korea, and Israel are the only countries with nuclear weapon capability. Israel, parenthetically, has never published this fact, but it is widely thought they possess the capability. Iran is aggressively pursuing nuclear power, and Al-Qaeda has tried to obtain nuclear weapons. Can the world successfully abolish nuclear weapons? Many people fear the dangers from the mere presence of so many of them in the world. The goal of some is complete nuclear disarmament. Is this possible? No. Historically, once new weapons are developed, they never disappear. Crossbows, for example, were declared illegal by the Second Lantern Council in 1139, but people kept using them anyway. The Hague Convention banned aerial bombardment in 1899, but people continue to use planes to drop bombs to this day. The earth will always have people whose hearts are evil. Therefore, the hope that nuclear weapons can be abolished is wishful thinking. The underlying assumption of many proponents of disarmament believes that man is basically good. So how can we effectively reduce the risk of using nuclear weapons? Two answers. One, deterrence by possession of a superior nuclear force. And two, an anti-missile defense system that would prevent weapons from reaching their targets. Such a system is not fully functional yet, but shows great promise of someday being developed. Regarding the first answer of superior force, the U.S. has over 30 allied nations around the world it has pledged to protect from nuclear attack. If the U.S. were suddenly to disarm itself, it would in a sense be failing these other countries as well. It may prompt them to develop their own nuclear weapons, thereby increasing the potential of nuclear war between 8 countries previously mentioned. Disarmament would lead to an arms race between these other countries, thus causing nuclear proliferation. What about the CIA and other such intelligence gathering entities? The CIA coordinates a spy network abroad. Is this a good thing? It seems to me that a necessary part of defending a nation is seeking to know about potential enemies and possible attacks before they happen. No doubt other countries are spying on us. The CIA has no doubt prevented immense harm to the United States at home and abroad. In the Bible, spies were not unknown. Joshua sent spies into the promised land. That's Joshua 2:1. David sent out spies to learn the whereabouts of King Saul. That's 1 Samuel 26:4. And David later sent out Hushai the Archite to serve as an undercover agent when Absalom, his son, was about to capture Jerusalem. That's 2 Samuel 15:32-37. Has the CIA and other such organizations done it right all the time? No. But neither have our presidents. Neither has any government organization. We cannot throw out the baby with the bathwater again. It's necessary that Congress have some oversight of the activities of the CIA and related intelligence agencies, as should the president. But too often, congressional oversight has led to damaging leaks of information. Who has oversight over congressmen? Ultimately, we must rely on the integrity of individuals to carry out their jobs with discretion, wisdom, and righteousness. Christians have the responsibility of electing such individuals into office and voting out those who fall short of the standard. We are told to pray for those in authority, not to criticize them. That's 1 Timothy 2:1 and 2. We should be generally supportive of the CIA and not succumb to Hollywood's paranoia of these agencies. Moving on to coercive interrogation techniques of prisoners, much negative publicity by the media and eventually Congress has somewhat limited our use of previously successful techniques. The discussion has been made more difficult by lack of clarity in definition of terms, especially of the word torture. Some people think torture means extreme measures like cutting off a person's fingers or toes or gouging out an eye. So if this is not torture, what is? How far can we go without stepping over a moral line? Senator John McCain, who was a prisoner of war in North Vietnam, had endured severe torture and suffered permanent physical harm as a result. He insisted that the U.S. policy should be no torture ever. His introduced amendment prohibiting any cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment of prisoners passed the U.S. Senate by a vote of 90-9 in 2005. But under questioning, McCain admitted he did not intend this prohibition to be absolute, but the language of the amendment allowed no exceptions. McCain himself later admitted there had to be exceptions. Hence, there is an inconsistency here. The Geneva Convention of 1949 is standard policy of the United States and many other nations of the world. Under these conventions, it is allowed to imprison a combatant in order to prevent them from re-engaging in war as long as that war continues. Their confinement should not include any measures whose primary purpose would be to cause them suffering or pain. Are there any exceptions to this policy? When someone enters the United States to carry out a terrorist attack, that person forfeits the status of prisoner of war for 2 reasons. 1, he is deliberately attacking civilians, and 2, he is fighting out of uniform, i.e. disguised. Therefore, according to international law, he is not entitled to the protection of the Geneva Conventions. Some terrorists have planned for future attacks or have planted bombs that will be detonated in the future. This has been called the ticking time bomb problem. The moral and legal status of this a type of terrorist is different because he is still currently engaged in the immoral and illegal process of concealing information that could save thousands of lives from terrible destruction. That is, he is currently complicit in mass murder on an unimaginable scale. The moral question then becomes, is it morally right to use less than humane treatment in order to attempt to compel the terrorist to do what is morally right, namely to disclose the location of the ticking bombs or the identities and locations of those planning to carry out the future evil attack? In such cases, I believe a government has the right, if not even the moral obligation, within specified limits, to use such compulsion. Not to would be completely fail at government's God-given responsibility to, quote, rescue the weak and the needy, and to deliver them from the hand of the wicked, Psalms 82:4. Some might object that the terrorist thinks it is morally wrong to reveal his plans to murder thousands of civilians. He thinks he is morally right to carry out his terrorist attack. Who am I to say who is morally right and wrong? Based on different cultures and religions, they say? This is where humanists fail and Christians shine. We have an absolute standard of right and wrong, whereas the others only have relative standards based on the whim of men. Our standard never wavers. Theirs changes continually. The Islamic terrorist actions are clearly wrong because, one, their war is contrary to the historic standards for a just war, because their purpose is to conquer other nations to oppose Islamic law. Two, they are intentionally targeting innocent civilians, which is contrary to the Bible's standards for the conduct of war and contrary to international law. Critics of enhanced interrogation argue that if we inflict pain to extract information, it will cause us harm in terms of world opinion. I believe sometimes the higher moral ground demand we do things that are right even if it is to our hurt. Terrorists respect only one thing, superior force, coupled with courage and strength. Having said all that, there are some actions that should be prohibited under all circumstances. These would include rape, denying medical treatment to prisoners, sadistic humiliation, such as was committed at Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. It should never be acceptable to force a prisoner to violate their religious convictions if it poses no threat to the United States or its defense. And any actions that would cause permanent physical damage to a prisoner, such as cigarette burns, cutting off of fingers or toes, etc. So what does that leave us? Scripture does speak of applying the rod of discipline to a child, which causes physical pain but leaves no permanent injury. Extrapolating to a prisoner scenario, any action causing physical pain is not necessarily beyond the purview of moral bounds. I see no moral reason why certain drugs, such as sodium pentothal, also known as truth serum, might be administered to extract secrets from a prisoner. What about waterboarding? This technique involves holding a prisoner down so that his head is lower than the rest of his body while he faces up. A cloth is placed over the mouth and nose while water is poured over it. This action causes a sense of drowning without actually allowing water into the lungs. This same technique is used on U.S. troops in training to resist the enemy if captured. In a 53-46 vote in 2006, the U.S. Senate rejected a proposal to prohibit this procedure. In January 2009, however, the newly seated President Obama prohibited it by executive order. I submit this procedure does not seem to be inherently morally wrong. It causes no permanent damage, and interrogators are given specific limitations to prevent water from getting into the person's lungs, which would be medically contraindicated. But does it work? Do morally acceptable forms of physical pain used to extract information yield usable results? Critics say that the information gleaned from a tortured person is useless because they'll say anything to avoid more pain. But the facts of recent history show that argument to be incorrect. Coercive interrogation techniques used on al-Qaeda operatives brought very significant results. The terrorist Abu Zabyada disclosed information that led to the capture of Ramzi bin al-Shib, another of the planners of September 11th, who in turn disclosed information which helped to lead to the capture of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, mastermind of the 9/11 attacks. The techniques themselves were used selectively against only a small number of hardcore prisoners who successfully resisted other forms of interrogation, and then only with the explicit authorization of the director of the CIA. Fully half of the government's knowledge about the structure and activities of al-Qaeda came from these interrogations. In other words, these enhanced interrogation techniques worked remarkably well. Not to have used them would have been morally wrong because it would have meant having the ability to stop the murder of thousands of people and not doing it. Moving on to the topic of homosexuals in the military, a former policy instituted by President Clinton was the so-called don't ask, don't tell policy. Basically, it warned homosexuals not to tell anyone if they're of their sexual status, but if they were caught in the act, they would be discharged from the service. The reason given for not having homosexuals in combat units was because it would create an unacceptable risk to the high standards of morale, good order and discipline, and unit cohesion that are the essence of military capability, unquote. Military personnel have repeatedly stated that inclusion of homosexuals in the armed forces harms combat preparedness and effectiveness. Homosexuality, as discussed earlier, is a sin. Christians should advocate against any kind of activities, marriages, or military service which sanctions homosexuals to participate. Regarding women in combat, I believe it militates against the role of women as described in the Bible. It is not a matter of competence or ability. It is a matter of obedience to God to what roles He assigns to us. Women can act like men, but then they lose their God-given gift of being women. In addition, it is almost axiomatic that a woman prisoner will be raped by the enemy, probably repeatedly. Is this something women are willing to accept, or that men are willing to let them endure? All right, moving on now to the next specific topic on foreign policy. Every government should have a policy of how they relate to other nations of the world. What should be the goals of the foreign policy? Is it right for the U.S. to try to promote freedom and democracy in other nations? Should Israel be treated just the way we treat any other nation, or does Israel have some special status in the eyes of God? What should be the policy of the U.S. regarding the immigration of people from other countries? What should we do about illegal immigrants who are now in the U.S.? The Bible teaches that a civil government is established by God to do good for its people as God's servant, Romans 13:4. And it should, quote, praise those who do good, 1 Peter 2:14. It should also punish those who do evil, same verse. Therefore, the foreign policy of a nation ought to work toward the goal of defending itself against attack or harm from other nations. The foreign policy of a nation should serve to protect the sovereignty and independence of that nation, and to protect and defend the interests of its citizens in their relationships with other countries. Any country or personality aggressively pursuing a goal of one world government should be opposed because this dissolves any idea of a sovereign nation. Protecting other nations from being thus attacked should also be of interest for the same reason. Governments should seek to do good for other nations as they are able to do so. Jesus talked about loving your neighbor as yourself. That's Matthew 28, 22:39. Positive influence on other nations can come through diplomatic negotiations, cultural exchanges, education exchanges, commercial relationships, and fair and honest media reporting. Military and financial aid may also be appropriate. Protecting the sea lanes of the world from piracy or from other nations' ships attacking the merchant or passenger ships of another nation would also be in the nation's purview of responsibility. Developing a navy for such purposes should be a part of a nation's foreign policy, given that nation has an outlet to the sea. Luke 12:48 says, "To whom much is given, much is required." The U.S. has been blessed by God with much. Therefore, ours is the greater responsibility. Another benefit the U.S. provides beside a powerful navy is the maintenance of the Internet, a system that benefits the entire world. A third benefit is NASA's over 30 Earth observation satellites. The information these satellites provide is disseminated to all nations for vital weather and geographic data. Another benefit the U.S. provides is maintaining the headquarters of the United Nations in New York City. Some might object that the U.S. imposes its democratic views on other nations. First, we should define impose. This is not a military term, but a term of influence. Christians have been given a mandate by God to preach the gospel over all the earth. This is not a military venture. It is edict to influence the world with the good news of Jesus Christ. No one becomes a Christian by force of arms. It must be voluntary. Its dissemination must occur without violence or coercion. In the same way, it is incumbent upon the U.S. to influence other non-democratic nations toward democracy for the following reasons. The Bible always condemns slavery and oppression and views freedoms in a positive light. The Bible also suggests leadership should come from the people as those chosen by them to government. An example of this is the Old Testament, is the choosing of the 70 among Israel to help Moses judge the people. That's Numbers 11:24. In the New Testament, 7 deacons were chosen among the people to help out with the distributions to the widows. That's Acts 6, verse 3. This implies the desirability of some kind of democracy. Democracy gives greater accountability to rulers, helps prevent a misuse of power, and helps to guarantee that government will serve for the benefit of the people rather than for the benefit of the rulers. God warned Israel against the appointment of a king or a one-man government. Many abuses of despotism ensued. Human rights ultimately come from God. These rights can never be legitimately taken away. These, quote, rights are by covenant with God. A people who do not enjoy a covenant with Jehovah have no rights. We all deserve hell because of our sin. The only way we have any rights is by way of mercy. The Declaration of Independence states that a government is established to secure these rights. The rights declared in this document were life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Most scholars argue that pursuit of happiness equated with John Locke's idea of estate or property. The Bible describes man as essentially free to choose between life or death, blessing or cursing. It consistently condemns slavery and oppression. Private property, as previously discussed, is a well-established idea developed in Scripture. Thus, a government supporting these ideas would be supported biblically. The Declaration of Independence goes on to say that government is only valid if they have the consent of the people. When Moses was given mandates of the law, he brought them before the children of Israel with the idea of consent. Do you want to be governed by Yahweh and his laws or not? Thus, the same notion of consent by the governed is implied. Those who do not wish to participate in God's government were not forced to do so. They were free to leave to do as they wished. This idea carries over implicitly in the New Testament. The house of God, like the body of Christ, is something one comes into voluntarily. No one is forced to submit to God and his government. Civil government should not prevent anyone from immigrating to other countries, if they so wish. Civil and religious freedom come with a cost. A government should oppose other nations that do not advocate freedom of democracy whenever possible. Again, this does not necessarily mean with military force, but by influence. We should not be ashamed of promoting democracy and freedom in communist or Muslim countries that oppress their citizens. This may become a bone of contention with these countries, but so is the gospel. Influence can take the form of radio broadcasts like Voice of America or the Internet. Leadership should voice their opinions against rigged elections or oppressions and imprisonments of people who are innocent in other countries. This may cost leadership some political points, but I believe God will honor support of freedom principles. The United Nations can be construed as the predecessor of world government system and therefore should be condemned. While this may be true, because the United Nations is now the only effective forum where representatives of all nations can meet and negotiate and debate, I think the United States has no choice but to stay actively involved with it. If the United States were to pull out, the United Nations decisions and policies would become even more forcibly anti-democratic and anti-American. In the last few decades, the United Nations has become dominated by a significant majority of countries who are anti-American and even more strongly anti-Israeli. Military aid, whether through gifts or sales of weapons and airplanes and military training, should be used to help other nations defend themselves against attack and to maintain their freedom in accordance with just war principles. Integrity and wisdom is warranted as to whom such aid should be given. It has happened in the past that aid has been given to factions that support U.S. economic concerns rather than those who advocate for democracy. It has also happened that both sides are corrupt and aid in either is to our disadvantage. We must not throw the baby out with the bathwater here. Abuse is no reason to discard the idea of aid. Humanitarian aid in the form of food, water, medical supplies, and funds should be the desire of any nation toward others. The parable of the Good Samaritan is a biblical example of this idea. The U.S. has given more such aid to other countries than any other country in history. I believe this is one reason why the U.S. is a great nation in the world today. Economic aid should be restricted to emergencies, especially to poor, corrupt governments that take the money for themselves and withhold it from people that need it. The practice of economic aid to such countries tends to entrench corruption in government and create an atmosphere of dependence on foreign aid. Regarding debt forgiveness of poor countries, some Christians have invoked the idea of the Jubilee 50th year in Scripture as reason to forgive nations their debts. Aside from the fact that Israel never practiced this law, taking out a loan today from a World Bank or another country is not the same thing as doing so in ancient Israel, where everyone, the borrower and the lender, knew about debt forgiveness in 50 years. This is not the stipulation of any loan today. Today, it is understood that if you borrow money, it is under the promise of paying it back in due time with interest. If someone does not wish to do this, then they should not borrow money in the first place. Debt forgiveness today is really a plea to lenders that they should make voluntary charitable contributions toward the poor countries that have borrowed from them. The moral flavor of these pleas places an implicit accusation of guilt against lenders. The banks and governments that made the loans are suddenly viewed as wrongdoers because they actually expect that the loans will be repaid. There is biblical precedence for the giving of funds without expectation of return or without interest. There is also warning against usury or exorbitant interest on loans. But these are voluntary actions, not law. It's up to the lender whether or not they want to participate in these actions. Expectation that they will or should is, I think, a form of coercion. Borrowing nations do not want accountability for their inability to pay back their loans, because this would prevent them from making loans in the future. The forgiveness of loans is really a form of promoting a welfare economy. This is a counterproductive result of debt forgiveness. It tends to perpetuate corrupt regimes. The fundamental problem of the vast majority of these poor countries with massive debts is corruption in government and poor business practices and laws. What these poor nations need most of all is to develop productive, self-sustaining, growing economies. Forgiving debt or giving aid may meet some short-term need, but does not change the government corruption, oppression, and destructive economic policies that have caused the poverty in the first place and continue to perpetuate it. The International Monetary Fund has a list of 35 countries that qualify for debt reduction. This list corresponds almost exactly with those governments that are least free and most oppressive and corrupt. Historically, those countries that have had their debt forgiven are still in poverty today and are still repressive. Who actually pays for the debt forgiveness? It's the stockholders of the bank, including many retired people who have their pension plans or retirement savings in stock. The World Bank gets most of its funds from the U.S. government. Thus, it is actually U.S. taxpayers who have made multi-million-dollar contributions, quote, to these poor repressive countries. Most of these funds go to the wealthy rulers and their friends in such countries. Regarding foreign policy in the nation of Israel, the earliest people group recorded that occupied that area of the world was the Canaanites. You can see Genesis 10:15 through 19 for that. God promised this land to Abraham and his descendants. That's Genesis 15:18 through 21. Under the leadership of Joshua, the Israelites entered the promised land and drove out the Canaanite people. The indigenous people groups living in this area had reached the point in the eyes of the Lord that said their sin was full, quote. This means effectively that they were so entrenched in their egregious sin that no amount of witnessing would dissuade them from their path. And so it's really the mercy of God that cuts off sinners who are in this state, because it minimizes the amount of eternal punishment they will receive in hell, and it relieves the righteous people living with them of the sin load they received from their presence. The process of eradication was not completed during Joshua's time. See Joshua 13:1 through 7. Full occupation of the land was not completed until the reign of David, many years later. Nevertheless, the nation of Israel was established in the land. Its largest expansion of territory occurred under the kingship of David and Solomon. Then the kingdom was divided and gradually diminished until the Babylonians finally conquered the last of the kingdom of Judah and exiled the people off to Babylon in 586 BC. Persian dominance succeeded the Babylonian Empire in 539 BC, followed by the Greece in 333 BC. After the Grecian Empire broke up, a period of independence began with the Maccabean revolt in 167 BC. Roman rule began in 63 BC, culminating with the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Muslims ruled off and on beginning in 636 AD, followed by the Ottoman Empire, that is Turkish rule, in 1517 AD. The British began to rule in 1917, and an independent state of Israel was established in 1948. There was never been a time in its entire history that when an independent Palestinian nation existed in this area of land. On November 29, 1947, the United Nations passed General Assembly Resolution 181, which recommended the establishment of two separate nations in the land, the nation of Israel and an Arab nation. But the Arab residents of the land refused to accept this resolution and refused to constitute themselves as a separate nation. Israel, however, declared its independence on May 14, 1948, in accordance with the policy of the British government that had been declared in November 2, 1917, in the Balfour Declaration. It reads, quote, "His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political statutes enjoyed by Jews in any other country," unquote. The very day after the Jewish people declared a sovereign state of Israel, May 15, 1948, the armies of 5 Arab countries, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and Iraq, attacked Israel. Miraculously, Israel emerged victorious, and a ceasefire was declared. Soon after, Israel was admitted as a member of the United Nations on May 11, 1949. During this war of independence, about 3/4 of a million Arabs fled or were driven from Israel and found refuge in the neighboring Arab countries. A slightly greater number of Jews fled Arab countries during the same time and fled to the fledgling Israeli state. Jewish refugees were accepted into Israel, but the Arab refugees were refused acceptance in most of the Arab countries. Jordan received them but kept them in refugee camps. Those fleeing to the U.S. or UK were eligible for naturalization after 5 years. Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq have yet to receive them. Their descendants are now entering the 4th and 5th generation of statelessness. The reason for this non-acceptance of refugees into the other Arab states is the need to establish an independent Palestinian state. It is also a virulent agenda by many Arabs to wipe out the state of Israel. The present-day conflict between Israel and surrounding Arab nations is ostensibly about the size of its border, but ultimately it's about the objection of its very existence. Jordan and Egypt are two exceptions to this, in that they have signed peace treaties with Israel and have recognized its existence. The Gaza Strip is a portion of land in the southwest corner of Israel that is about 25 miles long and 7 miles wide. Its population is 1.5 million. During the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, Egypt occupied the Gaza Strip, yet it never became an official part of Egypt. Israel took over the Gaza Strip after the Six-Day War in June of 1967. Israel then created 21 new Jewish settlements in the area. In 2005, pursuing the goal of land for peace, quote, Israel decided to withdraw from the Gaza Strip. Unfortunately, peace did not result after this withdrawal. Instead, Israel got an Iranian-backed terror base 50 miles from Tel Aviv. Hamas rocket launches into Israel increased tenfold after this. The UN was silent, absolutely silent. What was Israel to do when attacked like this? Hamas would intentionally launch its attack from crowded public areas or from schools or store explosives in private homes. To my thinking, this is cowardly and disobeys the Geneva Conventions of War. Israel decided to attack. Before the attack, they bombarded the area with leaflets notifying the populace of the impending attack, along with telephone calls and text messages urging people to flee the area. On December 27, 2008, Israel sent fighter jets in a series of airstrikes against specific targets in Gaza. This was followed by a ground invasion in January 3rd of 2009. The UN Human Rights Council subsequently accused Israel of war crimes, while mentioning nothing about 12,000 missiles that were launched indiscriminately against civilian targets over a period of 8 years. As long as the Palestinian Arab leaders and the surrounding Arab nations insist that their goal is to total destruction of Israel, and as long as they continue to insist that Israel has no right to exist as a nation, I see no point in negotiation between Israel and the Palestinians. The only way to maintain a reasonable amount of peace in that area is for Israel to maintain a strong military force and to use that force to defend itself whenever necessary. If the Palestinians would agree to lay down their arms and acknowledge the legitimate existence of Israel, they could have a separate Palestinian nation and tomorrow and live in peace and economic prosperity with other Jewish neighbors, with their Jewish neighbors. But if Israel were to lay down its arms, it would be annihilated. It would cease to exist as a nation. That distinction shows the fundamental difference between the two sides in this conflict. And with that, I think I'm going to stop here and continue next time. Thanks for watching. God bless you, and remember, the whole earth is full of His glory. Bye-bye.
It's beginning to rain. It's beginning to rain.